So I was part of another ADPlist session, and everybody, there you go. Anyway, I was part of another session, and one of the questions that came up was, how do you integrate UX design in Agile? And I remember the answer that the person had, I don't know, it just didn't seem totally like a solid answer. So I was like, you know what, maybe I'll try to take a stab at this. The thing to realize is that every team's different. Every, different departments, different org structure, that kind of thing. So yeah, this is how we do it. So there's no necessarily like right answer or wrong answer, but I figured maybe in sharing this, maybe it would either you know spur on a conversation or maybe give some people ideas. And if that works, then that's good enough for me. So anyway, all right. So today, things I'll discuss is so the Agile Manifesto and its 12 principles, which I'm not going to do it in like the boring, like let's read the textbook way, as much as maybe pointing to those and kind of pointing to modern examples of how things work. Our team setup at Threat Quotient, a high level overview of our process, the recurring meetings we have and the documents we rally behind, and then Q&A. So we'll kind of go from there. So, okay. So I grabbed this off online, and so this is the Agile Manifesto. That was actually the answer that the person had when the question was around UX and Agile. And they're like, well, I'd recommend reading the Agile Manifesto, which I don't know is maybe helpful, but probably not, to be honest. So anyway, so the whole point is on the left-hand side, you have different things that you're prioritizing over the other things. From my perspective, both things are pretty important. And sometimes people get very dogmatic about like the whole agile development thing. So prioritizing individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, which I guess is like advocating for features and that kind of thing, and then responding to change over following a plan. So, and then if you look at the 12 principles, I actually think these are pretty solid in terms of things. And so a lot of times for me, when I look at our process, it's like, are we hitting these things? I don't necessarily care about the prescribed way to do things as much as like making sure we're kind of doing the right thing overall. So satisfying customers through early and continuous delivery. Yep, got that. Breaking big work down into smaller tasks is always the best way to tackle any big project. Probably the only way to really tackle it and be effective. Recognize that best work emerges from self-organized teams. Yes, people like to own their own process and that kind of thing, and I think that's valuable, especially if you want people to be, have good morale and buy-in for things. Creating processes that promote sustainable efforts, yada yada. So all these different things I think are founded in a good place essentially. So, but the thing is, like this document and these processes are very old. The Agile Manifesto actually came out in 2001, and so if you think about it, in 2001, what things were around? This is actually kind of fun to look at. So there was a Nokia phone, which is like, man, that's a blast from the past. Monsters Inc. just came out, and then the GameCube was a thing that was released. So things were a lot different back then. And so generally, this is what the process looks like. You go through these loops. You always hear the concept of like failing fast, that kind of thing. But when you go back and you look at the 12 principles, there isn't the lost 13th principle of like wing it as you go. So essentially, one of the things that when you think of Agile from a pure development standpoint, it's like we should constantly be building things and iterating. But the reality is you don't necessarily have to build things. And building things without research essentially is guessing. And guessing is a really good way to spend a lot of money in an inefficient way. So the main thing I always point to is this, it's like the amount of planning that you put into whatever the sprint work would be or whatever the team's going to work on, you're going to get what you put in out essentially. To me, it's like Agile does not replace this need for for planning or upfront research or any of those things. And somehow in the industry, like there's this perception that it does, and I just don't understand it. So, and again, going back, let's look at design tools in 2001. There's Illustrator, there's Photoshop, which were glorious in their day, but now there's all different kinds of tools. You have Figma and InVision and Sketch and all these different things that are made more for collaboration and handoff and all that kind of stuff. So these aren't collaborative. And also keep in mind that prototypes back then likely involved coding. So people had to do development had to be involved to essentially make a prototype, unless maybe you're thinking of like a paper prototype or something like that, which was not nearly as common. So my main point is that Agile does not replace the need for planning, which then sort of puts you down this other path where people are like, oh man, but is that waterfall? Like if we're doing all these requirements up front, design, all that kind of stuff, like it seems like we're really doing waterfall. We're not doing things on the fly in the sprint and trying to figure things out with each increment, So to me, the concept of whether it's waterfall or agile, it's sort of like a flawed premise. It doesn't really matter to me. So to me, it's more, does our process allow us to assess if we're building the right thing, provide customers with value along the way, introduce chances to learn and pivot, enable us to accurately predict deadlines or set deadlines and deliver to them, and then have clear roles and boundaries of how the team should work so that we can scale as the business grows. So with that being said, I will say that my background is very much in both product management and UX, and so therefore I think you're going to see a bias towards like product management type things as I go through this. But anyway, so our team setup. Generally, so a lot of times I see UX designers that UX and product, a good UX designer is maybe more business centric, and a good product manager is more user centric. And so a lot of times there's like overlap, and sometimes I see like this weird turf war of who does what, and that should be my thing, or I should do the research, whatever. To me, I don't really care. As time goes on, you look at building a product as a set of things that need to happen, and as long as we're doing all those things, great. So to me, generally I think of it as a product planning team. So there's a product manager, a UX person, and a dev manager. And I'll show you, where they're involved with each different thing. But essentially, I see the product manager as owning the initial first step. The UX designer is very much tied to the hip with them. So the product manager and the UX person are working together throughout the entire project, essentially. And we actually, again, leading towards more of a product biased kind of role, I actually have it to where for our teams, the UX designer actually fills the role as product owner for the Scrum team. So they go to every single Scrum, they write tickets and requirements. Maybe they don't come up with the initial requirements or the high level requirements, I should say, but they definitely write up the requirements for their designs and how to execute, on them. And then they also review all customer facing work before merging it into a release. So when a ticket goes into stakeholder review for us, essentially once it passes QA, then the designer is one of the people, they're actually the product owner, but their UX background. They review it to make sure it actually meets the requirements of what they had, the design's on point, everything's spaced right, the flow's right, etc. So getting ideas to execution. So this is what our product planning process looks like. We have a discovery phase, we have a design phase, we have an execution phase. And on the one hand, you may be like, man, this is waterfall. Oh no. One of the things I see as waterfall is let's go dark for 8 months. We know everything. Let's do all this work. Let's ignore the market. Let's ignore everything going on. And then let's deliver something 8 months from now. We pop up and we're like, here's the thing. And customers are like, I hate this, So to me, I always see UX as the ability to de-risk something. And so we can still not forfeit this planning process and be agile at the same time. So I don't see them as like competing concepts, So in the discovery phase, you have the product managers going through doing different things, chance for feedback, talk to customers, same with design, same with execution. So this is generally what our product pipeline could look like, or I guess the concepts and how things sort of come to fruition. We have an idea portal, which is an aha. So imagine a project, comes up, product management says, I think this is something we should go after, some sort of initiative, whatever it is. They'll start to collect things through our customer idea portal. They'll talk to the field. They may talk to customers. They may talk to salespeople. Salespeople are in the trenches all day working with customers and our sales engineers and stuff like that. They're super valuable. To me, it's like a shortcut to getting answers to some things. Granted, you have to validate ideas because sometimes there's bias in there and that kind of thing. But then we also have Salesforce is our customer support portal. And so we may look through and gather ideas from there. Here are all the issues in this area of the software. Let's group them together. And now we have this sort of initiative. From those initiatives, we'll bake out different projects. From those projects, we'll bake them out into epics and user stories. And then we'll work with the team. Muted. Anyway, so that's that. And then, so next step. So this is kind of what it looks like in terms of like ownership. So the way I was trying to figure out the right labels, I sort of had like passive involvement and active involvement. I was like, I don't know if that's right. So in general, the blue is heavy involvement. So in the beginning, product management's largely owning, here's something, let's go after this thing. But UX and product design is, largely involved the whole time. So as much as the product manager may own that product spec or requirement stock or whatever it is, UX has their fingerprints all over it in terms of influencing things. Same goes for, moving forward as we're starting to scope these things. UX is the part of the part of the process that can take something from an intangible thing and make it tangible. So product management is largely involved with all of that, and they have their fingerprints all over that as well. So, but UX owns that. Also, engineering comes in at that point, and as an engineer, a lot of times when you're interviewing from a UX role, there's always the interview with someone from engineering or whatever, and generally they're like, how early do you involve us in the process? And to me, it's like as soon as we can, essentially. So even though engineering leadership may actually come in during the design phase, they may actually be part of the readout of the initial doc that we have, and be part of that process too. So they know what's coming and they can kind of figure out like, what needs to happen, or maybe influence ideas or whatever they need. So yeah, so going back to this, so now I'm going to break down each section. So there's discovery, design, execution. I'll show you some of the things that we use. So from a discovery standpoint, again, product management owns this. We start out, here's an old product spec that we have. And so it starts out with this doc, which is really just a dump of notes. This is more for both the product manager and the UX person to kind of work through this. I may, we use Google Docs for collaboration. I may highlight things, leave comments, suggest rewording things, like all kinds of different things here. But generally what we'll do is we'll go through an overview, the business case, high-level use cases. We'll list out the aha ideas, the high-level requirements, anything we need to support the project in terms of having a declaration. Here's the thing, here's what we're going to go after, here's our understanding of it now. So one important piece of this is at the end, there is a part that has key questions, dependencies, concerns, that kind of thing. So if anything comes up when we're reviewing this with the dev manager or UX or whoever, we can document the question and then we can try to get an answer to it as we go through the process. So this ultimately results in some sort of slide deck. These are some of the slides. This project was maybe around like 13 slides total. I just kind of picked some key slides. But you'll see the requirement summary. A lot of that will be influenced by UX based on talking to customers and trying to get a sense of, what do you think needs to be part of this? What makes sense from an ecosystem of functionality for this thing to exist? You also see the key dependencies, key questions. The key questions, again, we kind of carry them forward. It may be questions about scope. It may be questions about, how do we prevent this issue, or anything essentially. So, so in this discovery phase, we're answering open questions, we're trying to validate assumptions, we're testing the direction of things, and maybe as part of that, we identify misscope, unknowns in the project, that kind of stuff. And that's all from taking a concept and putting it in front of customers and saying, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think? Here's our thoughts. Can you think of a scenario where you've encountered this type of situation, and starting to tease out like the different aspects of the problem space. The product manager owns this, but UX is also largely involved. And this work kind of is like seamless. And as we make this declaration, we kind of carry it over and we continue to do this work. So then we get to the design phase. This is where we do prototyping and testing and learning and iteration. Again, we're trying to validate those different questions we have, infuse things with customer feedback. And again, that's the main thing, is like we're having customer feedback along the way the entire time. Going back to 2001, we had Photoshop and we had Illustrator. Well, now we have more things. This is balsamic, but you can make prototypes in Figma or whatever you'd want to do. I can make an interface that looks so close to our actual thing that sometimes we have to explain to the sales team this is not real, And in that same vein, I can do a lot of work without spending any money for development. So why would I not de-risk everything as much as I can here when it's just me or just my teammate or the PM and me doing this work, rather than having 7, 8 people on a Scrum team that all get paid 6 figures to do all the wrong work, So to me, it's like, let's do as much discovery and testing and, throwing speaking against the wall here as we can. Also during this phase, it's still going to generate more questions, and we're going to answer the previous questions. So, and part of this, so this is something that like a lot of boot camps and things don't talk about, is we do a design spec, is what I call it. We call it design commit at our company, but essentially it's a spec. I think of this as writing a help center article for whatever project we're working on. And it's more than just a Figma prototype. So imagine you're a developer and a designer comes to you, or actually let's switch it. Imagine you're a designer and you're trying to figure out what the software does, and the developer is like, oh, here's a link to GitHub, right? That's sort of the equivalent of here's a link to Figma. Here's a prototype, here's a link to Figma. Because you still have to go through and you have to like decipher everything and understand it. And there's a lot of ambiguity. And so to me, writing out the solid design spec considers things like upgrade path and, how do we go through and do these things? And what happens if you're a legacy customer? And, all the different weird things that maybe Figma doesn't talk about or isn't explicit about. So, it outlines more than the happy path. It's the ways that things could go wrong or whatever else it is. And so we'll work on this document, and then we'll sit with both engineering and product and say, okay, I think this is a project right here, And from my experience in writing user stories, whenever I try to slice a project up for the dev team, I always slice it like the wrong way. Like imagine there's like 3 different ways you could slice it. I'll slice it one way, and then the team will gravitate towards the other way, and I have to remake a bunch of tickets and deal with all the fallout. So I've sort of learned to not do that, and instead spend all my effort on this document, which then at that point, the team will review it with me. We'll go through everything together, document any questions during review, any concerns that the team might have, which again, we'll go and get answers for, or infuse with customer feedback. But meanwhile, this is a great way for them to then take this and break it down in terms of, well, here are the different scenarios and the tickets and all that kind of stuff. So as much as I say we write tickets, which we do, it's really a team effort, and maybe I'm the one driving, maybe the dev lead's driving, but I'm definitely there. Or someone, the UX person assigned the project is definitely there. So again, so you have this process overview. So now we're in the design phase, and we're validating design direction through wireframes or prototypes or whatever. And again, this is a chance to identify misscope. So maybe it's not like a pure usability test in the form of like unbiased, like here's a bunch of tests, try to complete these. But it's pretty good in terms of putting it in front of customers and getting impressions of here's what we're going to do. And, could you help me rank these different features that we have in terms of usefulness for you, and talk through why, So then we move on to the execution phase, which again, this is the dev manager. And now they're going through with their team, and they're trying to put their heads around, for the scope of this project, what do we think we need to do? Do we need any architecture diagrams? Are we in alignment on the approach that we're going to have for this? And again, this could feel kind of waterfall-y, but keep in mind, we're doing small increments for this. And we want to hit the sprint with a solid plan where everybody understands what they're doing and everybody feels confident. So they'll put together this doc and they outline a bunch of different things and API, what API endpoints do we need and what things we need to upgrade and all that kind of stuff. So at this point, we're sort of through the pipeline towards the upcoming sprints and current sprint and that kind of thing, and we're starting to ship incrementally. So again, UX job is not done. As we ship these different things, there's a chance to put our ear to the ground and listen. So we spend all this time designing something and de-risking our designs as much as we can, but it only goes to a certain point. Now things are actually shipping to customers. So the question is, we just shipped it. Are people adopting it? Is it meeting their needs? Are there any meaningful refinements we can make? A lot of times this will be a part where we influence the future scope of things. And I can think of projects where during phase 1 of development or milestone 1 or whatever increment we have, we are actively selling the concept of phase 2. So the company gets excited and we actually make sure it happens because we have a pretty strong understanding of the things we'll need. Well, a lot of times after we ship the first milestone and we start to watch what people are doing, that influences that second phase and our assumptions could be wrong. And so it's another chance to sort of de-risk something. So yeah. Also during this, imagine there's, common interview question. What happens if there's a disagreement on how something should be designed with the team? If we're constantly testing and we have like a regular cadence for this, then I can also bring questions to customers. Be like, hey, you know what? During Scrum this morning, we were talking about this thing. What's your perspective on this? And kind of get like customer input on it. So, which is cool. So, yeah. So next thing is about keeping in sync. This is very much more of a Scrum-like type thing, but I think to understand how UX fits in, it's important to understand like the different cadence we have for meetings, because once you get a better sense of that overview, you can start to figure out how to manage your work and fit in better. So this is kind of what the calendar view would look like. We work in 3-week sprints. We used to work in 2-week sprints. I don't know if there's really pros and cons to either. I think it's just, picking the amount of work to fit in the period. Sometimes people think 3-week sprints would be more work, and it's not necessarily always the case. But anyway, so we have a Monday product planning sync, which is with some people. I'll walk you through that. We have a sprint kickoff meeting, which is essentially where every Wednesday for sprint kickoff, the teams get together, including the UX person. We go through all the tickets that we're essentially trying to do that sprint, write up, refine any requirements we need, acceptance criteria, whatever, and then assign QA subtasks and subtask all the things to make sure everybody's doing stuff. Then we have a sprint check-in, which is the Thursday before the next sprint kickoff, and I'll walk you through that meeting. So for the Monday morning planning syncs, it's UX and product design people, it's the PM, and it's director of engineering. It's really a high-level coordination meeting. So it's like what's being planned, what's next, activity from the field, customer escalations, progress towards deadlines. It's not where the work happens, but it's essentially like a check-in meeting. It also encompasses tasks that like maybe aren't JIRA worthy. So like, hey, can you get these two people to talk to each other, or influence this thing, or round up the tickets in this and make sure they're organized in Epic, or whatever logistical things we need to do to make sure that the train stays on the tracks and everything's going smoothly. Our fidelity for this is like really low fidelity. We have a document. We add so imagine 6.7. So wait for this. So we'll type in 6.13. Then from there we go through the items under 6.7 and we just move them up. So clean up Pendo stats. Okay, so it seems like this might be done, so I might cross it out. Or if it's not done, I might copy it and move it up to the top. But we talk through each thing. This is a way for us to make sure that things don't fall between the cracks. This document is like 1 billion pages. we only focus on the latest date, and we continue to move things up as we go, essentially. So we don't use Jira for this. This is maybe for things that are not Jira worthy, but it's really effective and really simple in how we do it. So there's that. Then we have a sprint kickoff meeting. So again, going back to here. So sprint kickoff, we do a day of planning, and then at the end of the day, we get the dev leads together, we get product management and all the UX people together, and we're like, okay, cool. Well, here's what we're doing. We are, here are the external wins we'll have for customers. Here's internal wins in terms of like architecture or whatever it would be. But really it's for cross-team visibility. Product management now understands like, here are the things that can go communicate to the field. Expect these things in the next release. It's now a solidified list. And then we can also have a chance to reinforce like, here's what we're going after. Here are our goals. Here are external milestones. Here are customer commitments, whatever it might be in terms of like rallying behind something. So then we go back to the sprint check-in. So again, sprint kickoff. Now we're going, through the sprint. We're almost towards the end of the sprint. We're trying to get a sense of like where we're at. And in this case, it's like these stories are complete. These stories are at risk. These stories aren't going to make it. And we'll use a burn down chart. This is actually a really bad looking burn down chart, but I just grabbed a random one. So we'd use a burn down chart for this, and then each dev lead would talk through essentially like where the team is, what's the status on the different things. And then from there, we have a separate thing where we do a what's next, essentially like a future sprint planning. Our sprints this year are named after desserts, by the way. There's apple pie and baklava and cannoli. Before that was like movies and I don't know. So anyway, so if you see Earthworm Jim, the video game, that was the year of video games that we had sprint names, everything's alphabetical. But so we look at, the next 3 sprints, we assess which items are going to bleed and the ramifications of them. And then we also can assess the readiness of upcoming work, which again, if the UX person is the product manager, if the UX person is a product owner, it's in their interest to kind of advance these things and make sure that things are moving and well-defined. And so I blurred out some of the things here, but essentially green is well understood, yellow partially understood, red is not understood. And they'll go through and maybe there's some upcoming designs that they need to have to make sure everything's good. Maybe they need to throw a grooming session on the calendar, and we'll walk through like the ins and outs of the requirements of how this one piece works to make sure the team's in total understanding and that the UX designer knows that the design will be honored and it's going to be essentially thoroughly thought out and implemented. So from there, each UX designer really needs to find a balance. You're looking at your immediate team needs. Something comes up during the sprint, you should jump on it. Figure out like what do we need to do here. Sometimes for that we'll use balsamic. It's like pop open a thing, the team's talking through stuff, and we're just kind of quickly throwing together, oh, like this, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. I promise you, if the team agrees on something 2 weeks ago and there's no visual or documentation of it, they will all describe it differently 2 weeks from now. So if you can have some sort of wireframe or whatever, post it in the chat and be like, okay, cool. Now everybody can reference that. We're all good. You also have your upcoming sprint work. So you go back and you look at this and you say, okay, are there any loose ends from a design standpoint that we need to clean up for these to make sure everything's good? And then you have the longer term work, which is working with product on these product specs, which are going through that pipeline, essentially. So again, first time giving this presentation, and I'm just kind of giving you a dump of all the things we do. Maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, but this is kind of where we're at. And now I'm going to answer some questions. So let's go through these. Okay. So what is the best way to get customer feedback on your recent feature or design? I think like the way I perceive that question is maybe your route to getting feedback is a challenge. Which screen am I sharing, by the way? It shows, oh, I see, it's sharing the wrong tab. Let me do this. Stop sharing. Share this. Ignore phone call. this one. Bam. Okay. So first question is around customer feedback. So the way that's phrased makes me think that getting customer feedback is sort of a hurdle in itself. So I think the first thing to do is look at what things are in the way of getting customer feedback. Because why couldn't you get customer feedback at any given time? Maybe it's that you don't have access to customers. Maybe you don't readily have access to customers. Maybe there's like a bunch of yellow tape you have to go through to talk to customers. But to me, that seems like that's more of the problem than having to do with any recent feature or design. Which one of the longer term career advice things I would give is in the past, I've always felt the need to declare that like I'm going to do research in some way. And when I declare that I'm going to do research, if the company's not necessarily UX friendly in that way, the word research one has been a hurdle for me. So I sort of changed it to should we get customer feedback? Which if you say you don't want customer feedback, you kind of sound like an ass a little bit. You know, you're like, no, I'm perfect. I don't need feedback. So that was one thing. But secondly, I always like would ask permission of other people, you know, like, so I would think of, imagine there's like a VP of product or something, and you ask largely like, should we get some feedback on this? And then the default, like you're essentially giving them the chance to say no, instead of like, we get feedback and this is how we operate. So I've sort of adopted this thing where I'm just going to go and figure out what I need to do. And for us, part of it was partnering with customer support, or not customer support, customer success and customer support, I guess, to try to get a sense of like, you know, when do you meet with customers and can we jump on these calls and be part of them and develop a rapport with them, so now I have easier access to customers. So I think that's generally my answer for this is, you know, if you're having trouble there, that's step one, is like making sure to you know, open that communication channel. After that, you know, getting feedback on a recent feature or design should be pretty straightforward. You know, I guess maybe it comes down to recruiting participants and getting the right participants, but maybe you can rely on the sales team or sales engineers or whoever to help connect you with someone who maybe uses that feature or doesn't use that feature, you know. Or maybe you have something like Pendo or metrics and something, and you can look at that and start to tease out, you know, who's engaging with this feature. Maybe we can, you know, recruit them on that page or something like that. So, okay. What's your current process with sourcing customer feedback? Do customers volunteer? We don't have a good process. Okay. I guess it's similar vein. Trying to think of what additional information to add to it. Sometimes you can send out a survey, and then depending on who answers the survey, maybe they have more interest in a certain topic and you can recruit them that way. I do have, and our team does have a solid rapport with sales. We've actually had salespeople use us with prospects, where maybe there's someone evaluating our software. We have a lot of big enterprises that evaluate our software. One of the questions they may have is like, how receptive are you to customer feedback? Because we're about to invest a big amount of money with you, and we'd like to know that like, if something's bad, we can fix it, you know? So we may actually partner with sales and talk to prospects and do some sort of UX call after they've demoed our software or have had some sort of like, you know, trial period. And it's actually a selling point because like, wow, this is great. Like, you want to hear from me? That's awesome, you know? And it builds a rapport with the customer. And then at that point, now we have an open channel where in the future we could, you know, reach out and be like, hey, last time we talked about X, Y, and Z. We're working on this project. I'd love to get your input on it. And usually the answer is yes. So with that, I guess the caveat is you have to be careful about setting expectations. And so a lot of times what I'll do is whoever's on the account from a sales standpoint, I'll make sure they're included on the call. So that way they just have visibility into what's happening and everybody's just kind of comfortable. So, okay, so I'd love to hear more about what a design spec is. Again, so here, let's do this. I'm gonna pop open a new tab, spec. You know what? Let me show something that's old so I don't get myself in trouble. Probably a good idea. All right, so I'm gonna go back to that dashboard one. Um, Here it is. And I'm also gonna share my whole browser so I don't have to keep doing this. Okay, so what's in a design spec? Again, I would treat it as a help center article. So you're explaining all the aspects of a project. In this one, there's this initial release where we have this concept of customizable dashboards. And so I wrote about the upgrade path. There's not necessarily like a template to this as much as each project has different facets to it. And you're trying to be as thorough as you can in outlining different things. This stock is disposable at a certain point. So I use this to get my thoughts in order of how something should work. Anytime a question comes up, I'll document it on here. But then at a certain point, when the team starts breaking this up into tickets, this doc sort of like goes away a little bit, or the tickets start to take precedence and they'll be the updated version. And then this is kind of sunsetted and we're like, listen, honor the tickets over this. So, but for this, so creating a new dashboard, users will have the ability to create as many dashboards as they would like. To create a dashboard, user will click create dashboard link. Um, like this types of thing. Editing your dashboard, edit mode, here are the different things. I might have different notes about different stuff. Note sharing dashboards with other users will not be part of the initial release. Exposing different controls, adding widgets, moving and resizing widgets, refresh rate, the count widget, like all this stuff is way more in detail than like any Figma mockup might be. And it also talks about things like ordering and error messages and all kinds of stuff. But then at the bottom, let's see if this is a good one. Yeah. So at the bottom, as we're grooming this, I'm going through with product management first, and then the dev manager, and then the dev team. We will write down different questions that come up. And it could be like, how are we going to handle this? Which in this case, it might be like, well, this is out of scope. We're not doing that. And sometimes actually as part of this, like writing the anti-scope is a really good thing. Something like dashboards may have a lot of loaded terms with it or like, I guess loaded assumptions as to what it might mean. And so for this, it's like, here's what this project is definitely not, and we might have that as part of the requirements, even in the product requirement part, like early on, this project is this, it is not this, and therefore, don't get it mixed up or jump to any conclusions or whatever. So that is what our design specs look like. It's extremely valuable. I've seen from, so imagine someone joins the team a year from this project. I've had people message me internally at the company and be like, hey man, this doc you put together is so helpful. I now understand like how this thing works and I didn't. And so it was like really a quick like, dive into the product to understand something. And the way it was written was just like, helpful for me. So I can also go back and look at it and like, why did we make this dumb decision? Like 2 years later when we have new information, we're just like, man, that was really dumb. And I go through and I find like some sort of comment about it. And I'm like, oh, I get it. At that time, we made a compromise for this, or we, did whatever. We didn't have this information. So, okay. So let's see, did we shift around? So how does your team address design commit spec changes? Here's how it should work. DM, you can't build, yeah. Well, I think it's a collaboration because I don't want to design something we can't build. Like that's not helpful, And I think for PM, so okay, so this question is phrased as in like PM and UX are essentially like saying this is how it works. But imagine that product management is actually saying to the designer, this is how I want it to work. I've learned over the years that different people process problems in different ways. And so sometimes for a product manager, some people are more visual. And I remember early on, if a product manager were to make wireframes, I would get like really like, I'm like, what is this person doing? Like they're doing my role. This is ridiculous. You know, that kind of stuff. Over time, I've sort of learned that maybe that's the way that they process things, and that's how they can get an idea out. So some people, you know, some product managers I've worked with will build prototypes, like literally code prototypes to kind of try things out and live with it a bit to like understand it. That's totally fine. We'll have to reverse engineer that and, you know, tease out the requirements. But as long as they get to what they need, you know, that's really all I care about. And some people will be more of a read the manual type and will give you like a big, you know, here's a bunch of text in terms of what I want this project to be. And it just, you figure it out and kind of work around it. And to me, that's where the value of the UX and the PM pair, as long as they work together and they divvy up the work and they feel good about it, like I don't care, doesn't matter. So that's my perspective on that. Do you have dedicated team member or members that are always testing? So for us, I we don't have dedicated people for specific tasks. Instead, we have people assigned to teams and projects. And so they own the project like beginning to end. I don't know if that would scale in a larger company or not. We're pretty small. But for us, it is more rewarding, I think, to be able to see things through to completion. And it also maybe keeps you sharper in different areas of UX rather than like, you know, specializing in one thing. There are pros to either approach in terms of like shaping your team. But for us, you know, we don't have the luxury to have dedicated people for testing. We also don't have like, there's not always something to test. Like depending on where we are in the product lifecycle planning and stuff, we kind of follow the dev team through to some degree. So uh, I don't know, like maybe, I mean, I guess that's not true. Like we have the design phase where we're testing prototypes and stuff like that, and maybe you're testing, you know, after execution. But for a given project, there may be a little bit of a gap between, you know, us planning something and getting feedback and making that design spec to the team actually being ready to work on it. A lot of times I find that, you know, design team could spend 2 weeks on a project, map things out, and that project could keep the dev team busy for 3 months, you know, and it's just kind of how it is. So we kind of chip in where we need and kind of, you know, ebb and flow with how things are being built. So let's see. How detailed or formatted should the doc be? How often do you refer back to the documents during the design process? If this is for the design spec, it could be as detailed as you need it to be. I would go as far as, again, writing like what the error text would be and you know, that kind of thing. Another thing I didn't touch on, which I think is really important, because again, we're trying to be efficient and we're trying to have, you know, whatever we're building, we're trying to get it right the first time and not have a bunch of runaround. So there's this. Actually, hold on. Cover this. So part of it is writing good tickets, and maybe this definition lives in a ticket more than it would the design spec. But here's an article, and I'll paste it in the chat too, so you guys have it. Bam. Okay. So part of it, so there's this concept of three amigos, and this stems from behavior-driven development and testing. And so there's a video where it's a product manager, a developer, and a QA person. And they go through all the different scenarios that could happen for a given ticket. And then they document them. And that way the product manager is aware of like essentially what they're getting. The developer is confident in what they're building. You know, there's no ambiguity there. And the QA person knows exactly what to test. Well, I would argue that UX needs to be in there. And from that standpoint, you spend all these times making these designs. And there's different scenarios you go through to make sure that they actually behave the way they should. Because in the absence of information, people just make shit up, you know? And I've seen some pretty interesting things when requirements aren't really defined well, that you get it back and you're like, man, what, you know, we over-rotated in this area, we didn't need to do that, and this thing wasn't even thought of, and, you know, it's just kind of a mess. So it's much easier if you can write down different scenarios. So in this case, a scenario for the slider might be, I click on the score filter and a dropdown appears showing the slider. 1 and 10 are selected by default. The submit button is disabled. I then drag the left slider to 6, making the score 6 to 10. The text input below updates to display 6, and the submit button is now active. I click submit, the dropdown closes, my search results are now updated. So there's a bunch of things in there that maybe Figma may not have picked up on in your prototype or the person viewing it. For example, the submit button being disabled, or the search results. There's one world where they implement this where as you drag the slider, each notch updates the search results versus submitting it, and then all of a sudden it does one refresh and it's more efficient. So all those different types of things, are super valuable from a design standpoint because that's the user experience and how it works. And so I think it's really important for designers to be able to write these different scenarios in their tickets because it's really, conveying the intent of what you had and making sure it actually works the way you want it to. Because again, absence of information, people may over-rotate, do the wrong things, or whatever it might be. And they have the best intentions, and they're not wrong because they were never told what to do in that way. So that's that. Let's see. Did I forfeit my Slido thing? There we go. All right, so what else do we have? Learned a few things from presentation, but still worried. Okay, so way to learn Agile fastest. I actually think that, so a video I share with people, I'll paste it in the chat too. Let's go through my notes here. Line Lab. Okay. It's a great video. It's like 7 minutes, super entertaining. It's called Product Owner in a Nutshell. I really like it. It essentially goes through the whole process of what I've been going through. And it doesn't talk about UX, but it talks about the product owner role. And it gives you the overall, to me, like the essence of why Scrum and Agile is useful, in terms of being able to make a team predictable and shaping things in small milestones, incremental development, and all those types of things. So, oh, oops. That link doesn't work. I've been sending that link to people forever. Man. All right, well, I got to update that. So maybe they just kind of smile and nod and then look it up themselves. But okay, how do you involve content writers in the Agile process? What's the best way to get buy-in or research and actually incorporate that research from subject matter experts? So we don't have dedicated content writers, although I would think that during that design phase where you're prototyping or you're writing that design spec, I would think that they would be heavily involved in there in terms of what screenshots you have in the spec, error message text, all that kind of stuff. My admission, I'm horrible at writing content, so it's not really my strength. But I would think that that's probably where I'd want people to weigh in. Maybe from an information architecture standpoint, if we're reorganizing the nav or something like that, maybe they're involved earlier, in terms of like card sorting and hierarchy and all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure, but I think they'd be largely involved there. And then I would think they would also probably be tapped upon during Scrum meetings when a situation arises. Like, oh, here's an issue we didn't think about. What do we want to do in this scenario? Like, what kind of message do we want to show? What's helpful? How do we describe this? Like, what directions are on the page to help people figure out what to do? Like all those kind of things I think would be beneficial. So our design team is small. We have 3 people and myself. Product is also small. There's 3 people in product, and our organization as a whole is maybe 110 people. So again, depending on org size, some of these things may work, first not. And these things have been working really great for us, to be honest. So balsamic versus whimsical versus fig jam. I'm a fan of balsamic. It's all preference, to be honest. They're all similar in some degree. And to me, I've always found it funny when people do wireframes in Figma and then they put the extra effort to make them look wireframey. And it's just like, it's sort of a waste of time. But at the same time, whatever tool is the easiest to get ideas out, I think is good. Uh, there's two trains of thought. Like on the one hand, if you have Figma or Sketch and you have an established design system, it should be pretty fast to make designs for things, and maybe you can use that. On the other hand, if you have an established design system, I should be able to use Balsamic, make something super ghetto looking, and it should look exactly the same as what the design system would be because that's what we're using. To the point where I could even describe it with bullet points, and you should be able to have the design look exactly like what it should be. So, what is the size and scope for each sprint? Is it usually one feature at a time? I mean, it's better to have the team rally behind one feature if you can. But at the same time, life's not always like that, and maybe one feature is more back end heavy than front end heavy, and so therefore we have the way we have it on our roadmap is we have boulders and pebbles essentially, and so the pebbles are like smaller things that maybe just front end projects or back end projects or whatever, and so depending on where we are in a feature, if it's more front end or back end heavy, we may bring some of those other things in. But you also have to remember that QA is a shared resource across all the things. And so bringing something into the sprint means we should be able to finish it and everybody can do their pieces for it. So, ideally we try not to scope things as only front end or back end. In reality, sometimes back end things are really big and sometimes it's hard to do that and have that vertical slice. And we kind of wade through that water and we're probably not perfect there, but we do okay. So. Smaller the scope of the milestone, usually the easier that becomes. So, cool. Last question, what metrics do you report on a quarterly basis from UX design team success? Yeah, burn down charts. So again, actually, let's go back to this real quick. So if I go back to the Agile manifesto thing, there's one thing I have like a little bit of a problem with. The 12 principles. Hold on. Okay. Number 10, measuring progress by the amount of completed work. So that has to do with like busyness. Oh man, we did all the tickets. We did it. More than output and output versus outcome. So to me, the most important thing, and again, think of UX in general. There are tons of videos on how to properly do UX and all these properly do UX, quote unquote. I think a lot of it's theater, to be honest. Like, there's no way for people to go and validate, like, are these teams really operating this way? And so I think that it's really easy as a UX team lead to beat yourself up and think like, man, there's so many things we could be doing better. And so what I have to constantly remind myself is, at the end of the day, if something ships to a customer and it's been influenced by customer feedback and validated in some sort of way, we're probably doing okay. And so that's generally my gauge for a lot of these projects is like, if we're following these things and we're incorporating feedback along the way, we're fine. And you can use Pendo to track like feature engagement or different stats in that way. But generally for us, especially being a security company, not all our customers have opted in, which is really annoying, to be honest. But so from there, we have to rely on sort of a mishmash of things between both the Pendo stats, but probably more so anecdotal things and information from the field and ideas submitted to our customer idea portal and those kind of things. So it's much more of a qualitative thing than it is a quantitative thing for us, unfortunately. So cool. So I'm just gonna fast forward again. I don't know why it even matters. Anyway, that's what I got. So if you guys want to add me on LinkedIn, go for it. I'm happy to talk about any of these things. If you want to schedule an ADPlist session with me at some point, like I'm happy to talk through things. I'm happy to hear if you do something different and you're like, man, there's a better way to do this and we do it this way and this way is total shit, tell me. I'd love to hear about it, because why not? It helps me learn and figure out what to do different or better. So anyway, beyond that, thank you so much for coming. Hopefully it was helpful, and I bid you all adieu. So I'll see you guys.